This is the lecture on the prairie forest biome boundary. So there are lots of biomes around the world shown on this map. So we have tundra in the north, and then boreal forest to the south of that, and then further south we have temperate forests and grasslands, and those are the boundaries that are of interest here. So in this lecture we'll talk about the prairie versus forest boundary mostly, and then in the second lecture that I'll record later we will talk about the boreal forest versus temperate forest boundary. So ecotones are the edges or boundaries between natural communities or vegetation types, and this dates back to the early 1900s. So there's a transition from one dominant community type to another. This controls where wildlife species go, where materials go, seeds, leaves, nutrients, and so on. And it exists at a variety of temporal and spatial scales, as you'll see as we get through the rest of the lecture. There are transitions at different spatial scales or levels of analysis, and these refer to one of different attributes of the organisms involved. It could refer to the physiognomy, which is the morphology or appearance of the vegetation, so it could be forest versus grassland, or it could be a difference in composition. So if we have one forest type versus another, later on, for example, we'll talk about boreal forest of spruce and fir versus temperate forest of maple and basswood. It could also refer to both. Ecotones can have different spatial patterns. Broad ecotones have patches of both biomes mixed together over some area. It can be tens of miles or even hundreds of miles in width, whereas other ecotones can be quite sharp. Here's an example of prairie forest transition that's broad. On the lower left, where there are patches of forest mixed with patches of grassland, and then the right picture shows a very sharp transition from forest to grasslands. Here's some other examples, a broad ecotone of the tree line, where the density of trees just gradually gets lower as you go higher in the mountain. And then there are other tree lines that are very sharp, as you see on the lower right. And this can be caused by an abrupt change in the soil type, or it could be a very abrupt change in the climate that's associated with the topography of the mountains. And here's another one, tropical forest savanna transition, a very broad one on the lower left, and a very sharp transition on the right. So there are a lot of environmental factors that affect these ecotones or biome boundaries, and they also operate at multiple spatial scales. From the reading at regional and local scales, we have things like soil characteristics. These could change abruptly from, say, a grassland soil to a forest soil, or there could be patches of the two soil types mixed together. Microclimate can be influenced not only by the vegetation but by the topography. You can have north slopes and south slopes and so on. And there's competition among the species and genetics, and these interact to ultimately determine the exact position of the ecotone and whether it's broad or whether it's sharp. Ecotones are thought to reflect concentrated long-term gradients of one or more current environmental factors. Some of the biggest ones are latitude. Obviously, with more northerly latitudes, there's a colder climate, and that's going to cause a transition from forest to tundra or from grassland to forest. Precipitation and temperature are very important as well. So precipitation affects whether there's grassland vegetation or forest vegetation, so forests grow in areas with more precipitation. So temperature and precipitation are related to climate. They're they can be local factors, but they're often regional factors. And then there are a bunch of local factors that can kind of fine-tune the location of an ecotone. So differences in the pH or texture of the soils, especially sandy soils versus loamy or silty soils, can determine one forest type versus another, or grassland versus forest. Texture affects the moisture and nutrient content of the soil. Sandy soils tend to be drier and more nutrient poor. I mean, disturbances can affect these boundaries as well. Grasslands tend to have frequent fires that kill tree seedlings before they can reach a size where they can shed seeds, for example. And once a grassland is established, it tends to reinforce that frequent fire disturbance regime that keeps the trees out and allows the grasses to continue to grow. Land use history can be a factor as well. We'll get into some examples of that in Minnesota later in the lecture. And the biota, especially browsing by large ungulates, which could be bison or deer or moose. And we've already talked about that in a previous lecture, and we'll see some additional impacts coming up in this lecture and the other lecture on the forest, boreal versus temperate forest transition. So the main example in this lecture is the prairie forest boundary in Minnesota, and this is based on work by my former PhD student Nick Dons, who's now at the University of Wisconsin-Superior. So in Minnesota, we sit right at the edge of the prairie. To the west is several hundred miles of prairie going all the way out to the Rocky Mountains, and to the east is forests. In the warmer climates, it would be the broadleaf or deciduous forest of maple, oak, and basswood. And in the north, we have the Laurentian or boreal forest that has spruce, fir, pine, and as well as birch and aspen. So what controls biome boundaries here? And again, topography. North slopes tend to be wetter, so you might have a higher tendency for forests rather than grasslands. Patches of different soil texture again, so drier sandy soils might favor grasslands over trees. And then the grazing regime and fires are really important in the prairie forest boundary. So what data was used? We have data on the pre-settlement vegetation of Minnesota. It recorded not only the trees, but also where there was prairie, and where there were trees, the species were recorded at the intersections of the townships and the section lines, so every square mile. And we have data on certain environmental factors. One of those is precipitation minus evapotranspiration. So evapotranspiration is evaporation plus the transpiration of water by the vegetation, and the key factor there is whether there's a surplus of precipitation over evapotranspiration or whether there's a deficit, so whether it's a moist climate or a dry climate. We also assembled data on topographic roughness, in other words, how hilly, how many hills, how high across the state of Minnesota, distance to nearest water. We would predict that for places where it's close to water, you would be more likely to have forest than grassland. For soil, we had percent sand for soils across the state, and soil drainage, so we would predict that poorly drained areas that are swampy might tend to have forests like spruce forests or ash forests, whereas well-drained places near the prairie forest border might be more likely to have grassland. And again, sand influences drainage, and sand soils tend to be drier. The pre-settlement land survey was done from the mid-1800s into the early 1900s in Minnesota, and these surveyors divided the whole state into 2,500 townships, each of which is 6 by 6 miles. There's an example on the right, and then that's divided into 36 1 square mile sections. So there are 120 corners per township, 250,000 corners in the whole state, and in each of those corners tree species that were present were recorded, so 350,000 trees are in the database. So here's the data showing trees versus no trees for Minnesota. You can see the statewide there, so trees to the east and north, and then along the west and southwest of Minnesota there were no trees, so it was prairie. And then there's a blow up of one part of the prairie forest border from central Minnesota showing the actual section corners as recorded by the surveyors, and green if there were trees present, and yellow if there were no trees present. So here's the other data, precipitation minus evapotranspiration in the upper left, and the area where it's around zero is shown in the kind of brownish color, and the areas where there's an excess of precipitation over evaporation is shown in the greens and blues. And you can already see that there's a pretty good match there if you remember the forest map on the previous slide. And then topographic roughness, the areas that are in the kind of brown to reddish brown are very hilly, so that's southeastern Minnesota and the area along the north shore and boundary waters. And we have some very flat places shown in the dark blue, and then some places with intermediate topography shown in the green and yellow shades. Distance to water on the upper right, the reddish brown areas are far from water, whereas the blue areas are close to water, and as you would expect with 14,000 lakes and lots of streams, much of the forested area of Minnesota is very close to water, so it's shown in the dark blue. Looking at sandiness on the lower left, the reddish brown areas, orange and yellow, are the areas with sandy soils, whereas the green and blue areas are the areas where soils are silty or have a high clay content. And then for drainage class, we go from the dark blue, which is areas that are poorly drained, so the peatlands in northwestern Minnesota, just south of the Lake of the Woods there, have very poor drainage, whereas the hills with shallow soils on top of limestone in southeastern Minnesota have very good soil drainage and are shown in the lighter colors. So here is a series of maps that shows the predictor, or which of these factors is the most important predictor for grid squares that kind of run along the prairie forest border in Minnesota. And these are at different spatial scales, so in the upper left squares that are just a few kilometers on a side, or just a few miles on a side, and then we have squares that are about 10 miles and on the upper right, and then 20 or 30 miles on a side in the lower left, and then very big grid squares that are 40 or 50 miles on a side in the lower right. As you can see, with the one on the lower right at large spatial scales, the precipitation minus evapotranspiration is very important for most of the prairie forest border, not all of it, but most of it. Topographic roughness also plays a big role in the southeastern part of the state. And as you get to finer and finer spatial scales, it looks more and more like confetti because there's a number of different factors that were better predictors. So if you look at the two upper maps, there are places where soil drainage was the best predictor of where the prairie forest border lies. Percent sand is the best predictor in some places, and distance to water in some places, as well as topographic roughness. So at fine spatial scales, a variety of factors could be the best predictor of the position of the prairie forest border, whereas at very large spatial scales and very coarse grids, it tends to be precipitation and evaporation for most of the state, but topographic roughness for part of the state as well. So, given that the precipitation and evaporation was one of the most important factors for most of the prairie forest border, here's a look at that factor individually. And as you can see, the dark blue squares are the ones where that was a really good predictor, and the light blue squares, it was a poorer predictor. And you can see across all the spatial scales here, there's a lot of dark blue squares, which shows that precipitation minus evapotranspiration was a good predictor of the location of the prairie forest border. And so climate, especially precipitation balance with evaporation, really sets the location on a regional basis of the prairie forest border. So areas with a zero balance, where there's more evaporation than precipitation, tend to have grasslands, and those areas with a positive water balance, more precipitation than evaporation, shown in the greens and blues in the map on the upper right, tend to have forests. So the conclusions are climate is the ultimate regional boundary control, especially the precipitation and evaporation balance. Factors that fine-tune the prairie forest border at local scales, they're responsible for all the little wiggles in the line that you see when you zoom into the size of a township, are topographical variables like roughness and distance to water and soils, sand, and drainage, which is relatively unimportant when you get to spatial scales more than 10 kilometers or 6 miles. There are probably feedbacks with fires going on as well, or I should say there were. Since the prairie is no longer there, it's been replaced with corn. But feedbacks with fires for the original prairie were probably important in maintaining grasslands right up to the edge of the prairie forest border and preventing trees from invading. And also note there's some spatial heterogeneity along different segments of the prairie forest border. So topographic roughness, for example, was more important in the southeast and was almost as important as precipitation balance. So there is some heterogeneity there, and at fine spatial scales there's a lot of heterogeneity and much less at the larger grain sizes or big grid squares and large spatial scales. Another aspect of the prairie forest border is how abrupt is it? So we looked at some examples earlier of very gradual transitions from one biome to another versus abrupt transitions. So here we took 22 transects that were perpendicular to the prairie forest border, and so they run a considerable distance on either side of the prairie forest border. So in the map here, the little numbers of the transects are where the prairie forest border lies, and then the black lines show the transects. And so we looked at the climate gradient along those transects and the gradient from woody vegetation to grassland vegetation. And this is what we found. So there are 22 little graphs here that correspond to those 22 transects. And the distance along each transect goes from 0, which is at the west, to about 400 kilometers, which is the east end of each of the little black lines. And as you can see on the graphs, the gray line is the gradient in precipitation minus evapotranspiration. So it's essentially showing the transition in the climate from a dry climate on the left side of each graph, which represents the west, to a wet climate on the east side of each transect, which is also on the right side of each graph. And then in the little graphs, the black line there shows the vegetation transition from prairie, which is at the bottom, to woody vegetation, which is at the top. And as you can see, for most of them, the climate is a very gradual transition, but the vegetation has an abrupt transition. So this means there are feedbacks from the vegetation that sharpen the boundary. So it's not as broad as it would be if it just followed the climate only. Once you get trees, it tends to be shady and cooler, and fires don't occur as often. And once grassland is established, it tends to carry fires. and maintain the grasslands, so there's kind of a sharpening of the boundary by the feedbacks from the vegetation itself. So gradual transition from dry climate to wet climate, but very sharp transition on most of these transects from grassland to woody vegetation. And this just shows all the transects in one graph, and you can see there's 3 of them there on the right that are a little more gradual, but the large majority of these 21 transects have a very abrupt transition. And it occurs over a range of about 10 centimeters in the precipitation minus evapotranspiration. So when you go from a 0 balance to about plus 10 centimeters or so, that's where you make the transition from grassland to woody vegetation. And it's kind of amazing that a lot of the grasslands in southwestern Minnesota originally were very wet, so they were kind of marshy and they had wet species in. But the precipitation and evaporation balance overwrote that. So even if it was a wet site with a hard pan on the soil that caused it to be poorly drained, it tended to be a grassland if on average there was more evaporation than precipitation. So the vegetation changes relatively abruptly along the gradual climate gradient. The boundary exists over about 10 centimeters in the precipitation and evaporation balance, about 40% of the range across the entire boundary, and feedbacks and interactions of the vegetation with fires and other factors sharpen. In this case, it's mostly a sharpening of the boundary rather than a broadening of it. The third aspect of the prairie forest border in Minnesota is how it's been changed since settlement by Europeans, which occurred mainly in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. So we're going to compare the vegetation at the time of settlement by Europeans with the year 2000 and look at the tree taxa, since we have good data on where all the tree species were located before settlement, and we have good data today from the inventory. We can compare what has happened to the prairie forest border in the last 150 years. So here's some notable composition changes in different regions along the prairie forest border. In the northwest, aspen went up. The PLS is the Public Land Survey. If you look at the little table there, before settlement, and FIA is Forest Inventory and Analysis, so that's the contemporary data. So aspen went up, tamarack went way down, oak went up slightly, ash went up, and so on. And then the percent changes are there. Tamarack actually was a very common tree in central and northern Minnesota, and most tamarack was cut down to make railroad ties and telephone poles because it's a nice straight tree and it has pretty good properties. So that species was reduced a lot throughout Minnesota. Looking at central Minnesota here, oak went down, aspen stayed about the same, tamarack of course went down, pines went down, and ash went up. And then looking at the southern part of the state, oak went down, elm went up, aspen went down, ash went up. So there's a pattern here. Ash is going up everywhere. Aspen is going up in the north, going down in the south. Oak seems to be going down in the south, went up a little bit in the north. Let's look at a few of the details. So here are some maps that show the distribution shifts from 1850 to 2000. Starting on the upper left, we have all tree taxa combined. And so if you look at the first map there, it's the Public Land Survey. And then the second map, the one that's in the middle, is where trees occur from 1999 to 2003 in the forest inventory. And you can see that there are a lot fewer trees along the prairie forest border, and that's because of logging and land conversion into agriculture. And then we have individual species, so ash, for example, on the lower left map, a lot of ash occurred kind of in the central part of the state, whereas in the modern data it's more in the central and northern part of the state. Here's some other species. Aspen went way down along the prairie forest border, but it went way up in the forested part of the state, in the heart of the forest biome, especially in northeastern Minnesota. And that's an impact of logging followed by burning the slash that converted a lot of former pine forests into aspen forests. And again, conversion of the land along the prairie forest border from aspen into cropland. Balsam fir there doesn't change a whole lot. It just gets a little bit more abundant over time. Basswood on the lower maps there has some pretty big changes. We cut down the basswood in the bigwoods, which is that kind of black blob in south central Minnesota that existed before European settlement. And basswood expanded a lot in kind of the north central part of Minnesota. And that's one species that's probably expanding in the north because there's a warmer climate. A lot of these changes are due to land use changes by people, but there's also change in the climate, and so the expansion of basswood in the north is probably partly caused by climate change. Here we have elm, and elm was common in the big woods again, pre-settlement, and that was cut down and converted to cropland, and elm is expanding in the north. Jack pine in the middle maps doesn't change a whole lot from pre-settlement times to now. Not the best sites for farming. They tend to be sandy sites, although now in north central Minnesota they're cutting down some jack pine and converting it to potato fields because potatoes grow in sandy soils. Maple in the bottom. This is sugar maple and red maple lumped together, and again we cut down a lot of maple forests along the prairie forest border, and maple is expanding in northern Minnesota. Looking at the center map there in the bottom row, due to a warmer climate, especially red maple in the boundary waters is expanding quite rapidly due to the warming climate. Oak was very abundant along the prairie forest border, looking at the map on the upper left. And that was removed again for conversion to croplands, and oak has expanded, however, in the north central part of the state. And that was a response to clearing of the original forest followed by slash burning, and oak was responding to that fire, clearing of the land followed by fire. And in the early 1900s, when that was happening, there were very few deer to eat the oak seedlings, very few bears to eat the acorns, and so on. So oak was able to regenerate quite well, just slightly north of where it had been most abundant prior to settlement. And looking at paper birch, not much change there. And red pine, not a whole lot of change in the western part of its range, but it's greatly reduced in the northern part of its range because it was logged and cut for timber when the state was being settled by Europeans. Spruce, not much change, looking at the upper maps here. And tamarack, not much change in its location, but actually there's a reduction in its density in upland sites. It's still present in the swamps. It was the upland tamarack trees that got quite big, that were logged in order to make telephone poles and railroad ties. So we still have the swamp tamarack, and swamps are still in the same place they were prior to settlement, but the upland tamarack is much less abundant than it was. And then white pine, and here again we see a pattern of removal in the south, expanded a little bit in the western boundary waters in recent years, probably because of a warmer climate, because the climate for white pine is kind of marginal in the boundary waters. So range centers, if we look at just the centroid of the range of each tree, have shifted. And if you look at each of these here, it shows the pre-settlement with a black dot, and then if you follow the line, it's connected to an open dot, which is the centroid of the range in modern times. So you can see, for example, spruce only moved, the centroid of its range only moved a tiny bit, the same with balsam fir, but for oak it moved quite far to the north, for maple quite far to the northeast. The table summarizes for all trees it's an average of 41 kilometers to the north-northeast, aspen 61 kilometers, and so on. The biggest ones here are maple 99 kilometers to the north-northeast, and oak 140 to the north-northwest. Again, these are centroids of the range. If you just look at all the oak trees in the state and where's the centroid of that blob that you get on the map. So it's moved quite a bit to the north, and then there's a number of other species that have moved much smaller amounts. Maple, as I said, and basswood is partly due to a changing climate, as well as removing trees along the southern margin of the range. So two things going on there. So oak and tamarack have declined sharply. Fire-sensitive taxa have small to moderate increases. The range changes most of the western and southern range limits. If you just look at it as a range where the species can grow, it's remained stable. However, the abundance along the south and west is much less because of conversion to cropland. So the centers of the ranges have shifted to the north and east. And this is due a lot to removal of large numbers of trees in the west and south, but for a few species also due to the fact that the climate is better in the north and they're moving to the north. So tree density at the boundary, the prairie forest border, has declined due to human land use rather than climate, although it's likely that climate will influence that boundary in the future. So Minnesota is right at the crossroads here. We're right on the prairie forest border, and there could be some big changes as the climate changes. We expect a large magnitude of climate change here that could affect the prairie forest border, because we know the precipitation and evaporation balance is very important in the location of that border. So this is a biome map showing the three main biomes of Minnesota: the prairie, the deciduous forest, and the dark green. This is the boreal and birch forest of the north. And the question is maple, spruce, or savanna? Interesting question. Can much of that forest in northern Minnesota turn over to either from a boreal spruce, fir, and pine forest over to a maple forest, or even over to grassland or savanna? Well, as we said earlier, precipitation minus evapotranspiration controls the prairie forest border, and in a much warmer climate there would be a lot more evaporation, so we would expect that zero balance to move to the east. The grasslands would expand in a warming climate. In a lot of our tree ranges, we're right on the edge. Looking at balsam fir, white spruce, and paper birch, we've got the southern and western or southwestern edges of the range here. Those trees are very sensitive to that precipitation and evaporation balance. We've also got a lot of trees with northern range limits, but notice, like sugar maple, red maple, and red oak, but notice they also have their western range limit because they don't go out into the grasslands. So their western range limit is also in Minnesota. So this is what we think would happen for a business as usual warming scenario, where we would warm up about 10 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit during the summer and have earlier springs and later falls, and this would increase evaporation considerably throughout the growing season. And so that zero balance and where the prairie forest border sits, we expect for a business as usual scenario to move about 300 miles to the northeast. So this would take it to about Thunder Bay. So that would mean most of Minnesota would then be in a prairie climate, although in northeastern Minnesota you would be close to the prairie forest border, and there could be a mixture of patches of forest and grassland there, or savanna, which by definition is a mixture of grassland and trees. If we look out west in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they've had some very severe droughts along the prairie forest border out there, and this picture shows an aspen forest at midsummer that has died from drought. So along some parts of the prairie forest border, we're already seeing the death of forests and the invasion or expansion of grasslands. Hasn't happened in Minnesota yet, but it's something we think will happen as the climate continues to warm. There will also be droughts that will be longer, that will affect trees. You see in the upper left picture here, dead birch trees along the north shore of Lake Superior. That's due to severe droughts at midsummer in 8 out of the last 10 years. So a warming climate brings increased droughts with it. The lower left photo shows an area that blew down in a windstorm and the boundary waters followed by fire. And again, this had been a jack pine and black spruce forest for several thousand years, and the regeneration coming up now is red maple and cherry in that picture. But it could equally convert over to savanna in the future, because on such shallow rocky soils there's very little water holding capacity of the soil, and therefore the boundary waters is very susceptible to conversion from forest to savanna. And then insect infestation will change in a warmer climate. So these are all factors that will help push the prairie forest border off to the northeast, in addition to just the basic control of precipitation and evaporation balance. Deer grazing, of course. Deer can eat seedlings, and if the seedlings are growing slower because they're under drought stress in a warmer climate, that's going to help the deer eat them faster than they can grow and prevent tree regeneration. The earthworm invasion, which I've mentioned before in class, helps to dry out the surface of the soil, and this makes it worse for tree seedlings as well. So tree seedlings are being hit from above and below the ground by deer and worms, in addition to having to respond to a warmer climate. Here's an example, Sylvania wilderness in 2006 with high deer impacts. No earthworms in this case, but the deer have eaten all of the seedlings. And here it was before the deer had eaten all the seedlings. This is 20 years earlier. So actually a combination of drought making the seedlings grow more slowly so that the deer could eat them faster than they can grow led to the loss of that regeneration layer in the forest. So we're seeing some early signs here in the Midwest of these changes. Then for the worms, here's an earthworm-free maple forest. All of the yellow you see on the forest floor there is sugar maple seedlings. Several 100,000 of them per acre. And after earthworm invasion, the seedlings are almost gone. They're reduced by more than 99% in density and replaced with sedges and grasses. So here the earthworms are facilitating the invasion of grasslands into the forest as a factor in addition to the warming climate. So the earthworms are introduced. They eat the duff layer that makes the soil drier. In the summer, plants and tree seedlings die just because they were rooted in the duff. Same number of deer and fewer plants leads to a higher deer to plant ratio, and that leads to an increase in Pennsylvania sedge. And also when the worms invade, nutrients are leached out of the soil. So the combination of all these effects leads to warmer, drier soils, more nutrient poor, more sedges and grasses, and dieback of the forest, and a lush herb community on the forest floor being replaced by a simple one, or in some cases even invasive plant species. So the overall scheme here for the prairie forest border is a number of factors in the blue ovals: frequent and longer droughts, and chronic higher evaporation than precipitation, spread of exotic earthworms, more deer, more fires, more storms, more pests and diseases. And these will all kill adult trees and also prevent seedlings from being successful in replacing the trees. And hence, all of these factors will help push the prairie forest border along on its journey toward the northeast in Minnesota as the climate warms. So here is a biome diagram for the whole world. So wet areas are on the right, dry areas on the left, cold areas at the top, hot areas at the bottom. So you have, for example, tropical rainforests in the hot, wet places on the lower right, and tundra, which is cold and dry. It's dry in terms of the amount of rain that falls, even though the permafrost might hold water on the surface. There's not much precipitation. And in between that, we've got boreal forest, temperate forest, and grasslands. So here's where Minnesota is right now. We're on the triple point. We've got some grassland, some temperate forest, and some boreal forest. This is where we're likely to be in the future, sliding down the scale here to a warmer climate, likely to be more evaporation and more on the grassland side for the state as a whole. So, maple, spruce, or savanna, well, we've covered forests versus grasslands here, and it depends mainly on the precipitation and evaporation balance. We expect that balance point to move off to the northeast as the climate change, and there are many factors that will help to reinforce that change as the climate changes. In the next lecture, I'll talk about maple versus spruce, in other words, the temperate forest versus the boreal forest biome boundary. So that concludes this first lecture.